Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. So one of the things we're doing here with forecasts is I made a wave 1 forecast that was from late March through early May, and I charted it against both the InfoMullet forecast I originally made in early March and against the IHME forecasts that were made in beginning making in late March. So this is the chart. It shows the deaths of potential deaths of wave 1. And wave 1, I'm kind of ballparking now. This isn't the complete wave 1, but I'm just going to track it through probably mid-May and see where it lays out. And if you look on the left here, the vertical axis is the total deaths for US in thousands. The bottom is the calendar days from March 30th to May 14th. And these forecasts were made originally to begin preparing people on the mental models of how much death we could have in the month of April. And what we did is I plotted all these different forecasts, which are these lines here. But first I want to go these blue bands. These blue bands are milestones, mental milestones, and some are wars or diseases. It's ways for people to sort of compare the COVID-19 casualty rate in this 6-week period with some other well-known event. And all of these bands are US deaths, not enemy casualties or civilian casualties. Bottom here is the global war on terror. That's the 9/11 deaths and US deaths in Iraq and Afghanistan over all 19 years. Now, some people will say, well, why are you comparing a disease to a war? Because people get a feeling of what that means. They have in their head what 9/11, Afghanistan, and Iraq means in terms of a war, and I'm trying to use that as a mental milestone. It's an easy milestone. I could pick some disease that no one's ever heard of, but that doesn't serve as a useful comparison. So I'm not saying that the deaths are the same as a war, because those are obviously soldiers. It may be in combat or accident overseas, but I am saying the total deaths and the impact this is going to have, I'm using these as comparative milestones. The next one above is the average flu season. So over the last 10 years, the CDC tracks flu deaths, and it's about 13,000 or so. And so we put this as down here. The next band up is sort of a leap. This is the entirety of the Vietnam War. 60,000 died in that war. And then there's the 2018 flu. So this is important because the average flu is about 13,000, but in 2018 we had 80,000 die. So I'm putting this one as a separate one to show the difference. And then finally up here around 113, 115 is World War I, the US casualties in World War I. So these are some comparative milestones that we can use and track these forecasts. Now the forecast, the blue forecast, there's 3 of them. These are from the COVID-19 tracker, IHME, and you can see the website up here on the top if you want to go look at it. These were the forecasts they put out in late March. I think it was probably the 29th or 30th of March that I took these numbers. It's important to know they are constantly revising these numbers, and they do that because the model they're making is to guide policy decisions by hospitals and localities dealing with the crisis right now, which means as data changes, because we've been social distancing, because we've gone into mobilization and lockdown all over the place, because hospital rate utilizations that we thought were one thing turned out to be another in Europe, they're constantly revising their numbers, and that means that their revisions have gone a little lower. I use forecasts for a different purpose. I use forecasts to test explanatory truths. By that means I don't revise my forecast as new data comes in, because the purpose was at a point in time to say, here's a forecast, and to understand if we get it wrong, we get it wrong. It's to understand why we got it wrong and be transparent. The forecasts I did in early March are in brown, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 forecasts, and they range from a low here of the InfoMullet case number 4, which is closer to the annual flu deaths, about 13,000 if I recall, all the way up to these very high estimates, which I think the highest one here goes up to 405,000, which would actually be close to World War II. And the second of these sort of case number 5, high and low, if you remember, those were taking a huge order of magnitude error margin and saying, what if this is way worse than we possibly think of? And that second one actually crests out at about 270,000. I don't think those are likely. Those are really high end. But the middle part of these ranges, what's interesting, because I've begun plotting on a red line here the actual deaths. And as of the 11th of April, yesterday, we had about 18,000 plus or minus some deaths. And you can see many of those are in the last 10 days. And so we are now tracking in between these sort of COVID-19 mid and InfoMullet case 1 mid. Now this isn't predictive that this red line is going to continue along this trace. It may raise higher as this moves from New York into the south. it may decline and drop below one of these. But right now you're seeing it's falling somewhere, if we were to extrapolate it out, between a 80,000 death rate and probably a close to 60,000 death rate. 65,000, I think, is case number one. So we're going to continue tracking this, but there's another piece of data that I am tracking now that's going to be interesting for anyone who stayed following along with us and saw how we report on rates of change to understand periods that double. I hate to say that the death rate has a doubling period, but it does. And we can use rates of change to understand where that doubling period is. So that chart is here. And what this chart shows is the rate of change in wave 1 deaths over time. And so on the left here is the percentage. This is the percent that it grows per day, more deaths than there were the day before. And you can see here on the bottom is the same calendar date. And the red is the actual rate of change. So it showed that when I started tracking this, we were going between 20 and 23% rate of change. Well, if you remember, the simple math is 72 divided by the rate of change with the percentage taken off. So 72 divided by 25, every 3 days we would double our deaths, and that would be a really bad situation. But you can see here it's declining over time, and this is why I think some people are starting to get positive, because you can see it's declining down to where it's now down to 10%. I actually then added a 5-day moving average to show, because it is noisy data, so I smoothed it out. That's what this blue line is. It's an average over the 5 days, and that shows it's declining to down around 14%. And again, 14%, even though it's declining, a rate of 10% means that every 7 days it doubles. So if we have 18,000 and it's a 10% and it stays constant there, by this time next week, we'll have 36,000 deaths, and it's only April 19th at that point. So what we're going to want to see is, as this moves out of the sort of middle Atlantic region, and the question is, what happens to this rate of change and the death count as it shifts south? We're going to keep tracking this and keep this updated. But again, it's important to remember, with the way that we do forecasts, we are not revising our forecasts every time new data comes out. And that's not because we don't appreciate new data, but the point of these forecasts was to establish at a point in time an explanation of how the system works. And because we have a range, it'd be one thing if it fell completely outside our range, we wouldn't learn much at all. But if it falls within the range, it tells us which one was probably a little better as a forecast, and others it's not necessarily true. There's lots of things that could be causing it, but it definitely gives us a sort of horseshoe close enough understanding of how this works, which will help us prepare for wave 2 and subsequent waves. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a Mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.